I'm going to be talking today mostly about material from this book that Archon just mentioned, Democracy in America. Question: 60 to 90% of Americans think that we should have stricter regulation to combat global warming, that we should increase government aid to the poor, that we should allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices, that we should increase spending on education and infrastructure and expand Social Security benefits, that we should raise the minimum wage, provide government jobs for the unemployed, and expand background checks for gun purchases. All right, well, why don't we have those things? I want to suggest that there's two big reasons. The first is that because of partisan polarization and institutional gridlock in our government, little gets done at all. And second, that what does get done is determined by powerful and well-to-do groups, the economic elites and organized interest groups. When I started doing research on unequal influence, I asked how US government policy relates or doesn't relate to the preferences of American citizens. Now, the ability of citizens to shape what their government does is not the only thing that makes our country a democracy, but it's certainly one key element of what we mean by a democracy. It was what you might expect for high-income Americans and for interest groups, which is to say, the greater the support for some proposed change in policy, the more likely that policy was to be adopted. Once you take into account what interest groups and what the affluent want, the preferences of high-income Americans make essentially no difference. Policies that have strong opposition, say 10% or 20% support that change, are just as likely to be adopted as policies that have strong support among the middle income. These are the inflation-adjusted expenditures in federal elections since 1980. And as you can see, both congressional and presidential spending has increased dramatically. Now takes about $1 million to win a seat in the US House of Representatives, about $10 million to win a Senate seat. And in recent elections, both sides in the presidential contest have spent about $1 billion trying to win the election. So this graph shows you the proportion of all spending in federal elections since 1980 that was accounted for by 1/10 of 1% of Americans. So let me talk first about reforms to spread political influence more broadly. In three main categories: campaign finance reforms, lobbying reforms, and voting reforms. So with regard to campaign finance, one thing that is a very direct approach would be simply to empower smaller donors. We can also reform lobbying by, for example, slowing the revolving door by putting some real teeth into laws about lobbying restrictions after leaving Congress or state legislatures. And then we can empower labor, which Sharon will be talking about shortly, and other groups that sort of promote the voices and interests of working class and middle income Americans. Finally, we can reform our voting laws. So consolidating elections can help, and of course that can also boost turnout, since all elections other than the quadrennial presidential elections have really depressingly low turnout in the United States. Even if government is more equally responsive to citizens, there are still features of our government which make any kind of policy change difficult. Second thing is we can shift power away from party insiders and to voters. We can also reform the way we hold elections. Our democracy clearly is under threat, but the appeal of authoritarianism grows in large measure, I would argue, from the failures of American democracy to respond to the needs of ordinary citizens. The best way to defend democracy is more democracy, more functional, and a more egalitarian government, which would both improve citizens' lives, but also kind of revive the belief that government can play an important role in improving their lives, and that their own engagement in politics matters.
You really can't have a liberal democracy, and certainly a deep democracy, without a functioning labor movement. So why is the labor movement so important to democracy? Since the founding of our country, the concentration of power in the hands of a small minority has been recognized as a threat, maybe even the primary threat to the viability of American democracy. That's why we have a system of checks and balances. We have other kinds of separations of powers between the federal government and the states. Since the founding, that struggle against the threat of concentrated wealth and power has been continual. So it's no accident that the labor movement is also at a historically weak point. The percentage of Americans in unions now is lower than it was before the National Labor Relations Act was passed. We need to revive the labor movement now because it is the best proven policy to combat the kind of extreme concentration of wealth and power. We know from history that when workers come together and collectively build organizations that are capable of countervailing the power of the wealthy and the power of corporations, the outcomes are profound. As a result of the pandemic recession, it is clearly generating extreme winners and extreme losers. So why are unions important in this conversation? Because unions redistribute wealth. So first, we think labor law reform must start with inclusion to ensure that all workers can build power. There are very significant elements of systemic racial and gender oppression built into exclusions from our labor law that were there from the start. I think it's really important to finally open that up. We need to enable collective bargaining between unions and industries, not just unions and firms, and to help take wages out of competition by applying resulting agreements to all employers in a sector. Workers need to be able to engage in collective action that is strategic and effective. Workers deserve a voice on the issues that are important to them and their communities. I think that there shouldn't be a price of admission for other kinds of participation in the mechanics of democracy. So we recommend that the federal government actually subsidize employers so that they can give all workers at least some paid time off to engage in a limited amount of civic activity. We also need to find ways for a more diverse range of people to run for office, to enable people who don't have great wealth to be able to support themselves while running for office. It's a very difficult thing to do the way our system works now.